one. So the first one was from Rebecca around leadership, using the deck in leadership. I'm going to actually hand over to Larissa to talk about the question and what her response would be.
Hi, Rebecca, fellow Melburnian. Nice to see you. So Rebecca's asked about, yeah, no worries. So you're wanting to use the deck for one-on-one coaching, yeah?
For one-on-one coaching, that's correct. And as part of potentially a debrief or a program.
Yeah, okay. So this is where I cut my teeth on the emotional culture deck. Going out as a newly after a masterclass and feeling as a little bit kind of nervous about running it as a facilitator, I actually really used it with one-on-one coaching to really kind of get my head around it. So leadership coaching for me is about understanding your impact to others and getting that real deep self-awareness about, what triggers you and what you bring as a baggage as a leader. And so I really used it to unpack the individual. So I ran through it as, with an individual lens across of it, and asked people what they want to feel for success, and really dug deep into that. Talked a lot about, what others might be experiencing when you're feeling empowered, or on the flip side, when you're feeling disillusioned, what are the triggers for that? What's the self story, those sorts of things. So really unpacking it from an individual perspective, having a little break, and then flipping the cards over and doing the how do you want your people to feel. And this is where the power comes in understanding impact, right? So really digging deep in, if you want your people to feel joy on a day-to-day basis, then how are you doing that? What are you doing to enable a context that people can operate with joy in their workplace, or from home, or remotely, whatever that might be. So that's how I use it from a leadership coaching perspective. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. And I had similar ideas. So that's just qualified that a little bit more for me, because I'm not a facilitator. I've never facilitated a workshop in my life. So, but I'll take the plunge. But I think this will be a great way to cut my teeth, as you have.
Yeah, and I think, saying you're not a facilitator, I'd probably disagree with you there, because that's what a facilitator is, a great question asker, right? Mm-hmm. You ask the great questions that get people thinking. And so this is a mini facilitator role as a leadership coach, is using the cards and asking the great questions, and then using that question to lead on to the next piece of, information or insight, or, what that person's going to discover. So
that's really valuable. So I think that's just a little bit of introversion fear on my part. So that's a bit of self-awareness right there.
Yeah. Thank you. No worries. I hope that answers your question.
It lends itself so beautifully to one-on-one coaching and to some really sort of deep conversations, because our emotions show us what we care about. And so it's really getting leaders connected to that.
Yeah.
So the next question was from Duncan, and I'm going to hand over to Kaylee, because Kaylee's background is working in the tourism world of tourism. So Kaylee, are you happy to read out that question and cover your response to it?
Yeah. Thanks, Duncan, for a great question. So his question was around, I'm curious in the tourism context, how ECD came up, how is it relevant, and what kinds of results happen using it. So that is my jam. I have, to give you some indication, I have hosted ECD workshops on a boat in the middle of the Milford Sound, in a helicopter hangar, in a office filled with beanbags. I have done it in wineries. I've done it in literally any tourism operator you can think of. I've done it in a indoor skydiving wind tunnel. Like, basically, you can run it anywhere. The joys of tourism is that everybody that works in tourism also needs an amazing culture. We often think, just because I work in council or I work in finance, that you have to build culture in those spaces because it's not inherently fun, whereas tourism is. But actually, one of the big things about tourism is retention of staff. So that's how it comes up quite a lot, is we need to keep our staff. How do we do that? We've got this amazing jet boat or rafting company, but we need people to be here long term. And that, because obviously the training costs associated with keeping bringing people on every 6 months or every season is really expensive. And it also messes with your team dynamic. So that's where it came up to start with. And it also came up with the fact that tourism was really hard for the last 2 years. There was no people coming in the door, and that people in the tourism industry love customers. They love people. That is literally their bread and butter. Their joy every day is serving other people, and they didn't get to do that. They just sat around and talked about how it used to be in the good times, right? So a lot of the discussions that I was having with people was, how do you want to feel at work, and how can we create that environment, noting that the environment is really different now than it was 2 years ago. So that's how it kind of stemmed from that. And from those conversations, it's all about them building a brand or building an understanding as an organization, so that when they do recruit new people, that everybody comes in with that same sentiment in mind. And it's almost you hire based on that idea about, we want people to feel connected and inspired and proud. You hire really different people than if you want people to feel, love. And it's just about kind of looking at what you want to build your team as, and having this collective goal. So that's the kind of big one for me. And the results, I worked with a really big organization who was very disconnected. And so we did ECD workshops in all aspects, and then brought all that information back together and kind of went to the senior leadership and said, this is how your team are feeling here. This is how your team are feeling here. This is a collective kind of data pool of the conversations we've had. This is how I recommend to drive your business forward. So some really impactful discussions. Yeah. Thanks for a question.
Great.
Thank you so much.
And I don't know if you've read the Manage Your Emotional Culture HBR article, but I think some of the examples of companies and the research there, some of them were actually in the tourism industry. So if you've not read that, I really recommend that you read that. And you can also use the CX deck from a point of view of tourism in terms of how you want your customers to feel too.
Yeah, that's a really powerful way. Yeah.
So the next question was around from Joe, from with time constraints, how could the ECD workshop be broken up into several sessions across time? So a couple of things that I'll say on this one. So I've kind of cut and diced how to run these emotional culture decks lots of ways. I'll be really honest with you. When I first started doing these workshops, I was a little bit intimidated of like, oh, but it's 4 hours and you do it like this, and I don't know. But actually, I've realized that really sticking to that held me back in terms of working it around my client and their needs. In an online setting, I literally always cut it down. For me, I cut it into 2 sessions, two and a bit hour sessions. And I'll usually just cover off all of the top 5. So I'll get them going through how do they want to feel individually as a team, and how do they not want to feel individually as a team, voting using Mentimeter. That would be the first. And then the second half will all be around, empathy, what do you see and hear, behaviours, and a little bit around the actions. That's how I do it. The remote workshop plan actually has it, I think, split into 3. I've tended to do it in 2. I like to do them closer together to build momentum. But again, you might like to have a period of reflection in between. So there's not one way to do it split up. The only thing you have to, I guess, consider is if you split it up too much, are you fragmenting it to a point that you're losing the momentum and the impact? So it's setting in the workplace, again, it lends itself well to be done all in one go. But again, you can split it up, because sometimes getting some time, half a day of time from people is hard. The other point I do want to say in it is if you find the clients coming to you to say, I want this workshop, but I want it done half the time, you cannot do the 4-hour workshop in 2 hours. You can do a 2-hour version of the 4-hour workshop, and you have to be really explicit about what is included and what isn't. So I've had a client before that said, right, we want to do 2.5 hours, but we want to do it all. And what I've done is I've gone through what I would recommend putting in a 2.5 hours and what's out. And through doing that, they've actually decided they want to do the full 4 hours, because they don't want to have that trade-off. So I think if you're really explicit, but don't try to promise and rush through 4 hours in a smaller workshop, because you won't get the impact. Anything you want to add, Larissa or Kaylee?
No, I think you've captured it beautifully, Lottie.
Cool. So what was our next one? And does that, hopefully that answers your question, Joe? If we haven't answered the question, pop the second question in the chat. It happens. So the next one we've got is around low trust. So I'm going to answer this one as well. Me and Larissa were like, divvying them up as when you were in the breakout sessions. This question gets asked a lot about how do you use the ECD process in a low trust organisation. So I'm very clear when I have a conversation with a client, because quite often they'll say about there being low trust, is it's an implicit part of the ECD process that you will help to build trust. But trust is something that cannot be rushed. It's something that unfolds. As a facilitator, you can set up the right environment for trust. There are some things you can do beforehand in terms of having a chat with a leader and recommending, inviting them to lean into this and maybe share their emotions quite openly. When you ask for, I often say, does anybody want to share them out with the whole group? And if nobody does, I quite often point to the leader. I have had situations before when the leader has gone, no, I'm not sharing mine. And that's actually going against building trust. So that's why the briefing beforehand is really good to do, because it's that share of vulnerability. Other things as well in terms of tips you can facilitate as a as that facilitator of the workshop is really advising people that having chats around emotions, as much as you set them up to be the least vulnerable way of doing it, the emotional culture deck is not as vulnerable as people would feel if they were just not using the emotional culture deck. And it is quite strategic in how we lay it out. It's still a drain. Like, people will get a little bit of an emotional vulnerability hangover possibly at the end. Now, you don't need to necessarily say that they'll get an emotional vulnerability hangover, but what you might say is like, takes a lot of work. You'll probably find you're quite exhausted after this workshop. Give yourself a little space. Don't be surprised if there's some, a little bit of reflection and stuff that comes up. That's pretty normal. This is the digestion. It's a digestion process that we're going through when we talk about emotions, and emotions need to be digested like a meal. Otherwise, they will give you indigestion, which is a lot of what happens in a low trust environment. We've basically got indigestion of emotions we haven't been able to talk about. That's my belief anyway. So let it unfold. Don't push it. If you get to the end of the workshop and you kind of feel this leads into the next question about honesty, is it a dishonesty, or is it just a vulnerability of not being able to share emotions yet? That's not dishonesty. That's just a tenderness about sharing vulnerable stuff, and you can't rush it. So I'm also very clear, only share what you feel comfortable sharing, not pushing. If you push people to share, if you notice somebody in the group is just really not sharing as much, I wouldn't push them as a facilitator. This can be quite triggering. So I think that's about really picking up, walking around the groups, picking up on the room, really kind of feeling into the emotional vibe, because emotions are contagious. We're all connected through our nervous system, so you will kind of feel into that. Does that answer those questions? Does that kind of, and the honest, I'm hoping it gets the honesty question through. Something
that I thought I'd just chuck in, Lottie, as well, that might help is that when you are introducing the cards to everyone and you hold up your own card and share first, a really big part of setting the scene or setting the environment is choosing what you're going to share based on the group that you're with. So if you've got a low trust group, share something really deep and powerful and meaningful, because if you're super vulnerable, then they will more likely open up because they know that it's a safe space. If you're going to do it, then, and you don't know anyone in the room, then it must be safe for them as well. So don't just wing your card that you choose. Know what you're going to share in the room and have a plan B. If your team is way more vulnerable or has way lower trust than you think, have a really vulnerable story that you're going to share as your card as well.
Beautifully said. And it is something, you might have one that you're going to share, but you might all of a sudden pick up it's not appropriate in this room, but there's another one that is. It doesn't mean you're being dishonest. It's still something that's very pertinent and relevant to you. And that actually reminds me, you have to a certain degree, be willing to share your own vulnerability. If you've got a lot of vulnerability armor around you, then that's not going to necessarily open up the group. Just one last thing on trust. If you've been asked explicitly to build trust, I'm very clear that there's not like a part of the workshop that's around building safety or building trust. It's that implicit part. But sometimes I will throw in an extra section, and I know Larissa does this too, because we've kind of got this toolkit of other culture resources, and I quite often use the trust equation, which looks at trust equals credibility. So it's like, you've done this, you've got this much experience, you've done this, had this many years doing it, this much qualifications, etc. Plus reliability, you do what you say you're going to do, plus intimacy, which is that vulnerability piece, over self-orientation, that's that self-awareness piece. Well, quite often in organisations, they spend a lot of time on credibility and reliability, but very little time on intimacy and self-orientation. So what we're really focusing on in the emotional culture deck is intimacy and self-orientation. And intimacy, a way I've heard it described is into me you see. If you think of it like that, and I quite often will pop that in and say, how would you rate yourself on this? Where are the areas that you need to lean into? So that can be a nice little extra add in. So the next question is around, I'm going to hand over to Larissa, and also Kaylee can chip in afterwards if she'd like to, around the masterclass and leaders onboarding. So Larissa, do you want to go into that question?
Yeah, so Iman asked the question, how do you lead or pitch ECD with a bunch of different leaders in one room? Almost like an opportunity to build your pipeline of potential ECD clients. If you've been on a call with me before, you've probably heard this story because I do tell it quite a bit. When I started using the ECD, I was going out talking about culture, let's change your culture, let's look at your culture, let's unpack your culture. I was getting crickets, like no responses, really poor follow through. What I've realised very quickly is that your leaders and managers often think that culture belongs to HR or people and culture team, and culture is not theirs to touch. When you change your language and start talking about things like subcultures, high-performing teams, team intimacy, bringing your team together, those sorts of things is more the language that I found that leaders and managers respond to, because that is probably their number one worry. So I talked to a whole heap of leaders and talked about what was keeping them awake at night. And they said, keeping my team together, keeping my team happy, keeping them motivated. And so when you're talking culture, it's a concept that's probably too big for them. And so we bring it back to talk to what they can control and also what they have budget for, right? They are more happy to spend budget on something that's going to help their team as opposed to calling it culture. So that's probably where I see the opportunity to talk to that leadership group or leaders in a room. Kaylee, did you have anything that you wanted to add?
I think you're totally right. It is the crickets until they can tangibly touch something. So I often just play the game with people just to get them talking, because often they're like, oh, I've never had this discussion with people before. And actually that realization is super powerful. You don't actually need to, I personally don't think you really need to sell this product. You just need to play. And then the crickets will dissipate and the leaders will come.
Yeah, I agree. Getting people to get their hands on the cards as early as possible. If you're in a session where you've got the cards and they can use them, the hands-on experience, and then talking through that, it's I think, as Kaylee said, it's not about selling. It's not a sales thing. I'm really uncomfortable with a pushing sales strategy. But I found that if you get people to feel and touch the cards and talk about the cards and talk about themselves and that self-interest that people, are driven by, it's quite powerful.
Yeah, I'll share this quick little story that might help too. I was approached by a very old mate leader, and those of you in New Zealand will know what an old mate leader is. I don't talk about feelings, don't come near me with this wishy-washy. And he called me on the phone and we had a chat and we talked about, there's only so much you can talk about culture and this and the feelings and the emotions. But on the phone, he was just like super guarded. Not really, like, he was like, well, you can come in and you can talk to us, but we don't talk about feelings here. And it's like, okay, cool. So we went in and he arrived late to the meeting, and we'd already started playing, and so we'd already done the positive cards. And when he arrived in, we were on the negative cards and doing a retrospective. And I thought, oh shit, this is going to turn into a disaster. Anyway, so I said, you've got to pick a card. Like, this is what we're doing. Everyone else in the room has done it. The fact that you've arrived late, whatever, you're equal. Anyway, he picked a card, and he picked overwhelmed, and he explained his little 30-second story about why he picked overwhelmed. And the session, he played the game, and that was fine. And we got to the end of the session. He said, "Oh, well, how do you know people are going to share feelings? Like, how are you going to force them to do that?" And I said, "Well, you just did." And he went, "Oh, I didn't. Oh, I guess I did. I didn't really realize that I did." And so just by the nature of, having such a brick wall against it, but you make them play the game, and they just go, "Oh, well, she's told me to do this, I'll just play the game." It really connects with people. And actually, if it makes you feel any, I literally walked out of the meeting, and he said, "Actually, can you do a full implementation of this over the next 6 months?" So making someone play the game, so powerful.
So powerful. I'm just mindful of time, so I'll just try to get through the next few. So Julie asked a couple of different options for lunch and learn sessions online. So just as a follow-up question, it'd be good to understand a little bit more around what your objective is with that. Are you just trying to get people to have a play within an organisation? Like what's the kind of purpose of the sessions, and then we'll be able to better guide you.
Yeah, just a bit of an introduction to it, because we're not really using it at the moment in organisations. So I get like the retro, how's your week been, or how do you want your week to be, or something like that. I just thought, because it's online, if there's like a range, similar to a range of different leaders, a range of different people that don't know each other, is there anything else that we could do instead of 20 minutes or something like that? Not knowing how many people are going to turn up as well. It could be 4 or it could be 40.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I can tell you some of the things that I've done, but first and foremost, I would invite everyone to be a little bit creative with this and say, okay, so maybe, something that you could do in an hour is you could get people, if you're wanting people to just really understand themselves a bit better and get bought into the potential of this little deck of cards, you might say, right, well, let's just go through our top 3, how we want to feel and how we don't want to feel. You can give them a handbook that they can take away. You can get them starting. I would definitely get them starting to, if they're in a group, share with each other, which actually when they don't know each other can be really quite profound, because part of it is knowing that other people feel this too. I'm not alone. Oh, I really resonate with that story, even though it's a different emotion. They start to see that emotions have great wisdom and insight, and they really do give us some wisdom of where to go next, and are we kind of living to our values, I guess. So, but I would be creative. Like you might, on one session, you might go, let's put this around change. So it's all about the question that you asked, Julie. So just bring a question in. You will need lots of space for conversation anyway. So I wouldn't be worried about filling up an hour session. You'll fill that up quite easily. If anything, you probably need to put in less content than you think. And just like literally just have a little bit of a play, and then give them the opportunity at the end to do a little reflection of how they found that and ideas of how they might use this going forward. I don't know if that's helpful, but in terms of, that's how I would come in. I'd find out a little bit about the group and maybe think, oh, I'm going to bring something together around how to get people to thrive in their lives. And that might be the question. How do you need to feel to thrive in your life? How do you feel when you're not thriving, when you're down in the dumps or whatever? You can make it quite a funny, funky question. It doesn't have to be businessy, something that they will relate to. Does that help?
If I can jump in there as well, Lottie. So yes, there's a business side of it and there's the non-business side. I think having some fun with the cards is great. But if you've got an audience that are a bit more serious and need an outcome, so I'd be, sort of asking, what's the problem that you need solved? What's your biggest problem, pain point at the moment? And build a series of workshops around that, or lunch and learns. So, so if recruitment's an issue, let's talk about the recruitment experience, your experience from your candidate's perspective of what happens as they come through, and what do we want them to feel and not feel, and what are we setting up to do that. The other one is if, new projects are coming up, a project kickoff, what do we want to feel throughout this project? What do we want to feel at the end? That sort of stuff. Yeah. So relating it back to a problem that can be solved so that they've got buy-in to be able to then apply it to some real business issues once they, if you want to embed that in the organisation.
Yeah. Yeah. That's great to put it around a current challenge. And we talked about tourism. That might be another one. Duncan, you might just think, what's the challenges within tourism? Like Kaylee did, she looked at, the challenges around the tourism industry being hit so heavily by COVID. So, Yeah. Now, I'm just aware that we're about out of time and we haven't answered all the questions. So what we will do behind the scenes is we will do a little video to answer some of these questions that will be sent out to you. And but hopefully that gets you off to a great start. And there are some more of these meetup sessions. It would be wonderful if you could pop a note in the chat to say how you, or hold up a card if you like, you could do that too, of how you're feeling right now at the end of this. It's been a pleasure to guide you through. Do reach out if you have any other questions that you haven't popped in the chat today. At ease. Oh, that's great. Thanks, Bridget.
Delighted, Duncan. Nice. Connected from
Well
Kaylee.
done. Awesome. Thank you. Inspired. Awesome. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Wishing you lots of luck, joy, inspiration on your ECD journey. Thanks very much. Lovely to see you all. What, if any, are the dangers of using a tool like this soon after a different culture and values definition activity? So do you want to go first or shall I go first?
You can jump in. I think you had a really good answer before, around not overwhelming people. I think that's one of the key.
Yeah. So I think it's a really good question to ask this question because it does happen, and I see it happen a lot, is particularly the bigger organizations love shiny new tools and, a different model and a different training exercise. And each of them individually on their own, I'm sure, are really great. But when you add them all together, it's a little bit like the change. You can have individual changes that are managed really well and have got great outcomes. But if you throw them on people all at the same time, it becomes overwhelming. I love John Kabat-Zinn talks about overwhelm being that life is unfolding faster than you can keep up. And I think that's what can happen a little bit when you throw on things like the emotional culture tool with other stuff. That being said, you don't want to negate the opportunity to use the emotional culture when something has happened in the value space. What you want to do is look at how you can complement any work that has been done and reinforce it and look at almost like a Lego block that perfectly kind of can fit into what's been done already. But I think that does require you to do a little bit of thinking, take some time, take some pause, and really explore what's there already and what their objectives are. Because it can really underpin values work that's already happened.
Yeah, I think you've captured it beautifully. I think the important thing is, like you said, what are the objectives? What's the purpose of using another tool in addition to the tool that you're already using? Is it to get depth? And if that's the case, then talk about what the impacts of that depth might be, and what impact's going to have on the investment you've made in that previous tool that you've been using. Yeah. Okay.
The next question is, how do you lead pitch ECD with a bunch of different leaders in one room, almost like an opportunity to build your pipeline of potential ECD clients?
So that's the one that we answered previously around talking the language of a leader and a manager that are in that room around.
Slightly different. This is different leaders, like different leaders in one. Yeah, we've been asked this before. I mean, again, it's a little bit like the lunch and learn. Like, I think you just have to use your own creativity and think, what is the objective of what you're trying to get out of this? Are you trying to get people to book workshops? Be really careful on hard sell. Really, it should be, again, that implicit thing that by them getting excited about doing their own self exploration, I just go in with a few really well pitched questions. Yeah, I mean, it really is the same kind of answer as with the lunch and learn. It's like, you probably need more time than you think. You really need to get them to be using it for themselves, and that's when they will start to really buy into it or not. Sometimes people don't. It does happen.
Yeah, I think also getting that group to verbalise what their challenges are may be able to lead you. If 10 of the 12 people are having challenges around attracting candidates and people to their organisation, then you can talk about how you use it from a recruitment perspective and an employee experience perspective. If it's a different challenge around, not stopping to celebrate success, or realizing what's going on after we've finished a project and just moving on to the next one, then maybe it's using it in a retrospective.
That's a great idea. You could almost pitch at the start, like do a very short exercise that's around, think about and reflect some key challenges that you face as leaders at the moment, go into groups, talk about them, think about some key opportunities and things that you face at the moment, go into group and talk about them. Now, with that as your backdrop, how do you need to feel to navigate the challenges and take advantage of the opportunities? How do you not need to feel, but you realize you might?
Yeah, I think we've just created a new workshop there, Lottie.
You heard it here first. And this is the beauty, like and you must see this all the time, Larissa, the more you use it without always needing somebody to show you the way, you tap into that creativity that creates the best, like I get it, like the comfort zone is to follow something that's already mapped out, but actually some of the best ones are like really thinking about what's the problem I'm trying to solve, or opportunity I'm trying to
absolutely. And I find, Lottie, that a client will come to me and I always design from bespoke, but I always look back at the resources that the Riders and Elephant group have put together, or have in the Slack channel, or have on the ECC group, because there's some stuff in there that you can kind of pull inspiration from. You might not use it exactly as it's there, but you pull inspiration and use a part of it, or use a question that's in there that's really powerful. So
and I think that's why it's really good to be generous with what you've learned and what your journey, because it actually inspires others, and it's just that generosity and reciprocity just comes through. Any more questions? So Duncan asked, are there any other types of workshops that you use the ECD? That's what I'm taking from this.
It's a big question. It's a great question. It's a big question because people use it in so many different formats, don't they?
I mean, how long's a piece of string? I use this on retreats.
With
my kids.
Kids, family. I used it with a startup founder to look at her values and what she, how she wants to set up for her people, her staff, her team, but also how she wants to feel when she's raising money and raising capital. So that was an interesting one.
And the example we used earlier about actually you could, like the idea of actually doing it with the elderly, and like who often are seen as invisible. They don't get a chance to really share how they're feeling at probably a time in life which could be quite hard. So I think that's another opportunity. Education, it gets used in education. I think it's like really good for people just to keep, where are the areas that we haven't used it, that we should try it, see it as an experiment rather than tried and tested path.
Absolutely.
And has anyone used this with politicians in professional development? Yes, it is used in, I know that it is used with politicians because Parliament, some people went on the masterclass. I don't know about other countries, but I know it has started to be brought into New Zealand.
What a powerful tool to use with a group of politicians around empathy, right? Placing them in the shoes of others and how others might feel when a policy decision is made, or when a big announcement is coming, or when an election is looming.
It's huge. It just I think it's about not also having that endurance to stay the path, because sometimes they're not going to get it. I always think it's a bit like with mindfulness. It's like you're planting the seed, but you can't expect the shoots to come above the surface straight away. Sometimes they lie dormant for a while before they start coming up. So that doesn't mean the seed hasn't been sown, though. Any others? No, I think somebody asked, because that was somebody, because I was saying about how our nervous systems are connected. I mean, I think it's noted in a lot of the books around emotions, permission to feel, emotional agility, but a lot of actually where I get that from is a lot of my books on like polyvagal theory and anything to do with heart math. They've got a lot of stuff around heart connection. I play a little video sometimes in some of my workshops where you have loads of metronomes. And what you do is they all started separately, and you watch them, and eventually they all come
into sync
together, and that's what we're like as humans. So research just Google connected nervous systems, This is stuff that I've picked up from lots of the research papers that I've read rather than a particular book, but I know that it's talked about in things like Body Keeps Score, Stephen Porges' work on polyvagal theory, probably Lisa, the emotions lady, Lisa, I've forgotten her, Feldman Barrett, I think she talks about it too. That actually it's that before we even know what cognitively what an emotion is, we have a felt sense. And we pick that felt sense up quite often from others. And I use the example, if you walk into a room where someone's had a big argument, you don't know they've had an argument, you feel it in your nervous system as you go in. So hopefully that answers that one.
Yeah.
Cool.
There was one question about the price point for these workshops from Aman, and she said, I haven't really seen it in the ECD workshop resources yet, or ECD resources.
Yeah, there's a reason for that. Yeah.
Yeah.
You want to go first or me? Because we're probably
you can go first. But yeah, I can see that there is a reason. Let's talk it out.
So I'm often asked how much I charge, and I very rarely say, not because I'm trying to covet it, but because it's a very personal thing to do a cost, and it's all about the environment you're in. It's about the kind of customers you're working with in terms of their work context. So working with a big corporate and then working with a not-for-profit, it's not the same. But also your level of experience, also what you bring to the table. So somebody who's just done a masterclass is not necessarily going to charge as much for an emotional culture workshop as somebody like you and me that have done multiple workshops and have got multiple experience and research working in culture and emotions. So I think it's you have to look inside for what's right for you. And really put that on the table. And sometimes it's a little bit of experimentation. I know with me, I've adjusted over the time, but I still adjust based on the client that I'm working with. If I sell a big program of work, I make it cheaper. If I know that client is suffering financially, I modify. After COVID, I got people to pay what they could afford for a while because they needed it and they were financially struggling. So I think it's very easy to get caught in a dogmatic fixed view of what something costs when there's so many things to bring to the table.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. You and I think very similarly, I think, around that price point. It's a question that I get asked all the time, and not just in this group, but, in other facilitator groups that I'm part of, or people who are starting out sort of wondering what the cost, what's the average cost of a workshop. I really think it's a bit of a test and experiment with your clients to see what their tolerance point is. Remembering that as a facilitator, you're not just coming with your experience with the ECD masterclass. You've got all of your other experience and knowledge and background and qualifications that you bring with you that supports that facilitation process. So it's, and all of those certifications and things that you've paid for, they all need to contribute to the cost that you're charging and the preparation time that it takes. It might take you twice as long to prep for that than it would for someone else who's done this 10 times. So
blood, sweat and tears.
Absolutely.
It's easy when I started my business, I think people would straight away go, well, you've just started your business and you're charging this. And I was like, but I've got 20 years of working in leadership and I was an executive leader before I left the corporate world. I'm a really experienced facilitator and I've got a lot of credentials. So I wasn't starting from scratch. I'm out in a new business, but it's bringing that. I heard this model once, which I always refer to, which is really, it's about you're paid what you're worth based on, and then there's like a few bullet points. So you're paid what you're worth based on the skill with which you do it, the demand for what you do, and the current context and environment that you're working in. So, and what you're prepared to accept. That was the fourth one. I think they're quite good. It's like, am I prepared to accept it? Is it an ego thing? Can I make a good living from this? Am I selling myself short? Or selling myself short because I'm charging higher than I should do and I'm not getting any workshops? What really is my experience and unique experience that I'm bringing to the table? What's the demand? Is there loads of people out there doing the same thing? You've got to have a competitive edge. And what's the context of the environment going on in terms of that customer's situation? So that's quite a good little checklist that helps.
Yeah, it's a good one. It's a great question. I think it's a question that, many people are asking. So it's something that I think, I'm wondering how we can support the community to have these types of conversations. Maybe we're not mentioning how much, but we're guiding them with good questions like the ones that you've just asked, you know, for them to have something that's comfortable for them and that the market can tolerate.
Yeah. Yeah.